there for like 150 years. It's like one of the oldest schools on the East Coast, from what I understand. And the rest is history. I went into 4 years for computer engineering, which I was the first class, I believe, that actually was offered that type of degree. It did not exist prior to the class of 1992, which is when I graduated from college. And but what was interesting, it was such a different time, and nobody really knew enough about the industry and the technology that the curriculum I was given for those 4 years was outdated by the time I graduated. We were doing literally assembly programming and real hardcore nuts and bolts of computing and design chip bases and things like that. By the time I graduated, Windows 3.0 existed, and I had never seen it before.
Right.
I had never, because that's not something they taught. Because the usual way you teach a curriculum for any degree is the curriculum is set for all 4 years. No one knew that type of industry would change so quickly. And it's as everyone knows, technology is an ever evolving industry. What is cutting edge 1 year is old and out unuseful 2 years later. And you could already see that at that time. So by the time I graduated, I had a degree in something that really wasn't that useful, believe it or not.
Well, you quickly caught yourself up to speed, obviously, and you had yourself a long career in IT. I mean, you went nearly 25 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Almost 25 years, yeah.
Yeah. So I, and that's not why we're here today. We're not here to talk about your career in IT, but it gets us to the point that we are going to talk about. And so I think it's important to cover just a little bit of it. You're working in IT. My assumption is all this time you're still reading comics, you're still collecting,
Yep.
comics and toys and things of that nature. So how do you get from the point of, running an IT department for the city of New York to not doing that anymore and ending up where you ended up? Tell us a story there about how that happens to somebody like you.
Sure. So I, like you had said, like I had never given up on comics. If anything, I dove into that world even more. I was one of those guys who, you would see on Wednesdays literally with the stack. And when I say stack, I don't mean like, oh, he's got like 8 to 10 comics. It's like, no, I had a stack of 40 comics or 50 comics that I would pick up every week. I was reading everything, consuming everything. That's how much I loved it. And I always stayed a part of it. Like, and I loved conventions. I always loved conventions. Today there's these big box conventions like the ones that ReedPop run. And they're, I don't want to say commonplace, but they're not a surprise. Like if a convention gets 30, 40, 50,000 people, nobody is shocked by that number. But when I was growing up and even into my 20s, if a convention got a few thousand people, it was ridiculous. No one ever anticipated that. These were mostly these church basement, Knights of Columbus-esque shows. Sometimes there would be a hotel. If they got, maybe 1,000 people over the course of a few days, they were never anything big. But I became addicted to these events. I became addicted to going through the long boxes and going through the toy bins and just, trying to fill my runs. And, every once in a while they would have some creators. And it's always been fascinating to me in the comic industry. Unlike any other industry, any other fandom a person might have, the comic industry is the only industry that you can have some sort of direct connection with the talent. Like, if you're a baseball fan, the chance of you meeting Derek Jeter is probably slim to none. If you're a Yankees fan, you could have every Yankee memorabilia that you could possibly think of, but you might never meet your favorite player. But comics was a place where you can read your favorite comics and actually meet these people. So that got me even more involved in going to events. Like I was addicted to going to the conventions, not only to finding my favorite stuff or missing pieces of my collection, but now I get to interact with these my favorite creators or learn about new creators, which also would happen a lot. Um, I'd meet a guy and he'd be like, "Oh, I draw this book. Look at this. This is pretty cool." And I'd pick it up and like now I felt a personal connection with this guy. Now I'm going to start picking up that book. Um, so as the years, I kind of almost watched this industry evolve. Like there was these big, what we considered big shows at the time. We used to have them at the Penta. There were the hotel shows, these Greenberg shows, but they were not anywhere near what we have today. But
Those
I
were the shows that were like advertised in the comic books, right? The
correct.
Yeah,
Yes, you
yeah.
would see them if you see old comics from the 70s, 80s, you would see these shows. Uh, it was the Penta and the Plaza and the Hotel Pennsylvania. I think it eventually turned into like, um, maybe they'd be on a couple of different floors, spread out between, the aisles and the overhangs of the convention. Like there wasn't big giant ballrooms. So sometimes, like depending on the location, but it was like, oh, let's have it at a hotel and fit tables in every nook and cranny of this hotel that we can. Sometimes even in rooms, like you'd go down a hallway and the rooms would open up and you'd go into different rooms and see different dealers and whatnot. Um, and it started to evolve. Like by the early '90s, there started to be some early conventions. Mid '90s, there was the big convention at the Javits, the Great Eastern Convention, and of course, there was always San Diego Comic Con. I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry, but that was always the mecca. Like that was a myth to a kid like me from Brooklyn. Like
On the East Coast, yeah,
on,
of course.
on the East Coast, the idea of ever seeing this mythical convention called San Diego Comic Con, um, I couldn't fathom what it was. Hundreds of hundreds of creators, hundreds of dealers. It just didn't seem possible that you can have a convention of that size. But by the mid '90s, we started to grow these type of conventions in New York. So there was a Great Eastern Con, and then and that lasted a few years until it folded unceremoniously and started the Big Apple Cons, which were again in a church basement, um, and then evolved into the Great National Cons, and again just growing around. I'm rattling off a bunch of different conventions, but they started to grow. So now in the early 2000s, I got a really good career. I'm in IT. I've been in IT for a number of years by now. I'm in the IT heyday. Um, End of the '90s, right around Y2K time, was the heyday for being in technology. If you told somebody that you were in technology, they looked at you like
Ooh,
you were a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. Like it
in
was the
that .com bubble.
right. It was the
Yeah.
pinnacle. Uh,
Hmm.
Ironically enough, not many years later, you just became the computer guy, and everyone looked down on you. But at that point, we were at our pinnacle. So I got a little bit of folding cash, and now I'm going to do the absolute unthinkable. I am going to go to San Diego Comic Con. I am going to get on a plane, and I'm going to go to the Mecca, and I'm going to see what this is all about. And sure enough, that I did, and it was everything that I thought it would be and more. And then out of San Diego, I actually got the opportunity. I handled things a little bit differently than I had at all the smaller shows. Like you'd go to smaller shows and you meet people and you buy stuff and you introduce yourself and you just kind of walk away. But when I went to San Diego, it just San Diego back in those days, especially, had this very huge community vibe to it. Like it didn't matter if you were a guy collecting comics or if you were John Buscema sitting in the hotel bar. Like everyone felt like they were on an even playing field. You can talk to anybody, you can interact with anybody, and I kind of did that, and I started to make friends within the industry just by being, well, this uber fan, as it were. Um,
Well, let me stop you there because I want to dig into that a little bit.
yeah.
Eh, you say that San Diego had this kind of community feel to it, and that encouraged you to kind of maybe go outside that comfort zone of, I really love your stuff. Thank you for doing what you do, and walking away and going to the next guy, right?
Right.
Can you look back on this time, the first time going to San Diego now, and think, well, was I being more strategic, not just because I felt more comfortable, but because you realized when you got there that you wanted to be more a part of this, and maybe it was the right thing to do from a professional perspective?
Not from a professional perspective. I never looked at it and said to myself, I can break into this industry in some way. Because in my mind, at the time, especially, you had to be a creative of some sort. And I cannot draw and I cannot write. So I felt that if I didn't have any creative talent, I could definitely not break in professionally. But I did not feel, that didn't mean I felt that I couldn't become a part of that industry in some way, as far as befriend some of these people, get, on the inside track of some of the stuff, just be more in the know and more connected. That was very strategic of me. Like at that time, I was very conscious about, I want to start making friends within the industry, because I'm a fanboy, and get the benefits and the perks of such, right? Like, oh, if I befriend an artist, like I could get comics and I can get art maybe, and they can introduce me to other artists, and then maybe they'll be like, oh, let me show you some pages from an issue of Batman I got coming up, 2 months from now, but you get to see some sneak peeks and things like that. So I just wanted, it was more along the lines of getting on the inside track, kind of opening the doors and seeing what was behind the curtain. But I never had any intention of getting in the industry, because at that time I just didn't think it was a possibility. So again, at that time, I started making friends with people. I started making friends with people within the publishers, and it was great. It was, I again, as a fan, such a huge fan, I had gotten access to people and to things that I had never thought, dreamed possible. I had seen somebody in San Diego, and they're like, oh, when we get back to New York, why don't you come visit us at the Marvel offices, or come visit us at the DC offices? And I was like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
I get to walk through the halls of Marvel and DC? Like, no, that can't be possible. And it did happen. Like and then, as those relationships getting stronger and started to build and started to spiderweb out into other connections, I kind of befriended a bunch of folks at DC, and really just started being a regular fixture there. Like I would stop in, every couple of weeks and talk with some of the people that work there, and then we go out for lunch, and we would talk comics, because most of the people that work there, they're fans too. They're Uber fans. That's how they got into it. And then it came like, hey, Mike, we're thinking of doing this promotion. Like, what do you think of this? And would you like this? Would you? And I'd be like, yeah, I would. Or if I would say I wouldn't, they'd ask me why, and for some of my input. And it became kind of cool, because now, like, I felt like I was, some of the decision-making process on some of my favorite things were coming from me in some way. Like, they wanted to connect with their fandom. They wanted to connect with, see what promotions and what storylines would resonate, kind of, and they would kind of pass it by me. I really didn't do with a lot of editorial people, or any editorial people, but I would give my opinions on stuff, and they'd be like, oh, we're going to take that back. We'll talk to somebody about that. I don't think anyone ever knew that it was necessarily me. It's not like we talked to this fan and he said, type of thing. But I felt in some small way that I might have had some influence on some of the things that happened, just by being a fan and giving my opinion. So it was great. It was really a lot of fun. I would go up there, I'd see comics that were coming out weeks in advance, and I'd get to read them before anybody else. And it was amazing. And then it kind of, that went on for a very long time, until, like, the inside baseball of what happened was, Reed Pop had they had started New York Comic Con in 2006, and then C2E2 in 2010. They had somebody who was doing their Artist Alley stuff, but they had to